Hi HR Nation, welcome back to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast, the show where we explore the future of work with industry experts and HR executives in the world's leading global brands. Today we have a special guest on the show. We're joined by Arthur Woods, who's an entrepreneur, investor, author, and DE&I speaker. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Great to see you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. And for everyone listening, Arthur's just released his new book, so congratulations, first and foremost.
Thanks.
On that. So it's Hiring for Diversity, the Guide to Building an Inclusive and Equitable Organization. So tell us more. Let's start with your own journey and then we'll get there. Tell us a little bit more about you personally and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. And it's awesome to be here. I grew up as an evangelical Christian in a rural town in Northern California. I ended up getting into HR tech really coming out halfway through college. So I joined the LGBTQ community, which sort of just turned my entire world on its head. All of my sort of, preconceptions of what a professional career would look like, sort of were disrupted. And I landed in my first corporate job and experienced a lot of homophobia. And it really taught me just this fact that, wow, work doesn't work for every person. There are so many people who come from an underrepresented community and don't feel a sense of belonging in their jobs. And in feeling just personally how crippling that was, but also recognizing a great deal of privilege being a white cisgender male, I was really motivated to think of, what are ways we start to use technology, we start to build new models and new environments that bring out the best in people in their jobs every day. And entering into a new job where I was embraced and celebrated and I felt like I had an empowering manager, it absolutely changed the way that I showed up to work every day. So that really kind of got me on this path. I think it's very similar to so many of the leaders that you work with too, where, just passionate about creating change in the workplace, feeling like this is a great place to innovate, right? Mm-hmm. Work is just such a huge opportunity. So I've been starting HR technology companies for the last 15 years and always selling in, very similar to your story, Chris, working with heads of HR, hearing their challenges. DEI was always the one that, people said, we have not figured this out. We haven't cracked the code. We're writing the new playbook for what this looks like. As I was exiting my last company, I said, this is a great opportunity to focus here. And so for the last, 3 years or so, we've been building a company called Matheson and researching the inclusive hiring practices of employers and determining how we really write this new playbook. So that was really what led to this book.
Who is this for? when you wrote this book, who was your avatar? Who did you have in mind?
Certainly the HR leader who cares about this work and is struggling with this, sort of going from intent to impact, as we call it. I think everyone is in this mode of having a lot of intent right now. I think a lot of folks, as you know, are struggling with how do I go from sort of talking about this as a need to doing something about it. And but we also tried to write it for the leader who may not even be in the talent function, but has a team and influences hiring and talent in their organizations and doesn't know what to do. Mm-hmm. So it's one of the things we pride ourselves on is that it's not a complicated book. We've had people say that they've gotten through the book in a couple hours. That's great. It's meant to be practical, accessible, certainly written for the talent leader who has autonomy to make an impact. But if you're a frontline manager or even an individual contributor who cares about this work, there's something you can get from the book.
Let's start with a question which I'm sure most of our listeners know the answer to, but for those that may be new, why is hiring for diversity so important?
It's a great question. And I think if there's anything that the last decade has taught us is that there is a strong business case for diversity. And I know you all talk about this all the time, right? That having a more diverse team drives retention, drives financial performance, leads to a more inclusive culture. I think we have all kind of the business case there, and I think a lot of times leaders have approached this work and said we're doing it because it's the right thing to do. That's really true. It's right for society, but we know that it is actually what's driving innovation. And I think a lot of companies right now are coming to terms with the fact that a team that reflects the customer base you're trying to serve is the team that is going to do so effectively and is going to create the next generation of your products. So there have been, I think, tremendous sort of examples of why why there's an ROI for the work. I think in many cases, though, the challenge has not been convincing people of the need. It's been getting them to change their behavior to get to the sort of structure and systems that we need. And that was largely kind of why we wanted to write this, was let's just talk about what you need to do differently. You'll notice that we actually don't spend a lot of time harping on the business case for diversity. We sort of go in with the assumption that we kind of get that. Let's focus on what we need to do differently.
That leads me quite nicely onto my next question, because that was what I was going to ask, right? Not many people are arguing against why it's important, but there's still some reason they're not making any changes. What is it that's holding companies back? The biggest challenges they're facing?
Yeah, so I think there are three major ones. And if we were to boil it down, one is that we don't believe that leaders have a holistic and necessarily congruent definition of what diversity is. So, we worked with so many leaders where their definition of diversity is gender diversity and ethnic diversity. It's left out the fact that, what we focused on here was also including people with disabilities, the LGBTQ community, refugees and immigrants, right? So we focused actually on 12 underrepresented job seeker communities that we wanted to make sure we're in the definition of diversity itself. So that was one piece. The second was that, a lot of leaders, especially amid the great resignation that we're, experiencing right now, have believed that the only issue in their diversity, efforts is sourcing talent. We've had so many leaders just tell us, I need to find where these job seekers are. The moment we can find them and source them, we're all set. And what they realize later on is that a candidate that walks into a process that's not accessible and is not inclusive drops out. And when a job seeker is hired into a new role and they're not set up for success, they're not onboarded well, and they're not given support, they leave, go figure.
Yeah.
So we tried to focus on the systemic changes that need to occur across our life cycle to ensure that not only are we sourcing talent, but we're setting folks up to stay in advance.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Great Resignation itself, the buzzword, right, of the last couple of months, and we're in it right now, right?
We totally are.
I saw your LinkedIn post on this. I think it linked back to an article that you did. I can't remember what website it was on. It was really interesting, by the way. And I'll link it for everyone listening in the comments below.
Yeah.
That was really interesting. What are the implications, of the Great Resignations had and will have on companies' diversity efforts specifically?
You're right. It is so what's top of mind for everyone right now, because what's happening is the way that we sort of describe it is in the last year, if not already, diversity became this, sort of top, front of mind, top of mind priority. And all of a sudden, organizations saw, some of their team members leaving and oftentimes in droves. And they said, wow, like we now have to balance plugging holes with our diversity commitment. And in fact, maybe our diversity commitment needs to get set aside so we can just go back to plugging holes. So what it's led a lot of leaders, especially talent leaders, to do is to revert back to old ways of hiring, oftentimes, which meant taking shortcuts, finding the first person they could find, using, by the way, oftentimes really shortcut ways to qualify people, which goes back to, saying I need to find the person with the best advanced degree who came from the, most reputable school or employer. And what that means is, oftentimes really lessening the pool to a very homogenous group that we're recruiting from. So what we tried to write in that article was, wow, like, the Great Resignation really risks us going back, backpedaling on our diversity commitment, and largely by rushing, by cutting corners, by, taking this very kind of myopic view of diversity. And so we actually see, though, that amid these pretty significant changes, if we think about the implications of 40% of our workforce changing their jobs in this next, call it 2 years, it actually could mean that an organization could leap extremely far ahead if they do this right, And so rather than fall behind in diversity, imagine if, 40% change in your workforce, that could actually be, you could become a much more representative team, if you're intentional about this moment.
What would you say then to those hiring teams? Because I'm speaking to hiring teams at the moment, they're overwhelmed. And I'm sure they don't want to take shortcuts. They're kind of having to take shortcuts in order to deliver with this huge pressure on them. What would you say to them? What message would you give to them?
Yeah, well, the first is that, a hiring team should start to rethink their role. I think part of the reason that teams are so under-resourced and and overwhelmed right now is that they have personally been shouldering all of the responsibility. So I think if a talent leader or a DEI leader is not approaching this work right now and saying, I need to go do all of this on my own, I need to somehow lead our organization solely through this work, to I'm actually the catalyst to get my organization to take responsibility for this work. The third kind of major shift that we really talked about was we need to transfer ownership from just the talent and DEI team. In some cases, as you know, there isn't even a DEI leader that's owning this work. There's, this is just the talent team. To say, look, every single person who touches our hiring process should play a role and take responsibility. Every hiring manager who, is making a final decision on who joins their team actually plays a really pivotal role. And oftentimes, as you know, is the weakest link in this equation, right? And so we talked a lot about, there were some really amazing models. I think of this company called Horizon Media we work with, where what they actually did is they said, we're going to create 12 different working groups that speak to sort of how DEI has an implication on different parts of our business, from the products we create to the way that we serve the community, to the way that we change our talent structure. And instead of this just being a talent-led effort, we'll have talent leaders in each of these teams, but we'll also have senior executives and individual contributors. And they had hundreds of people on these working groups. And it was this awesome way structurally that they created shared responsibility for this work. And they've seen pretty drastic improvements to their diversity, partly just because there are so many more people thinking about it every day. And it's just an additional, sort of portfolio part of their jobs.
Yeah.
So I think those kinds of unique structures where we start to say, yeah, maybe as a talent team, we are literally the ones empowering the broader organization. That's really where we start to see the work become much more sustainable right now.
What would you say are the benefits of the Great Resignation? Or are there any in terms of diversity
I
efforts?
Think I really love that question. You're the first person who's asked me that. What's the expression? It's like, let's not, waste a good crisis. I think there is this moment where, we can, it's very clarifying what matters to us right now, and this is a really powerful litmus test. The moment that we have, we're under-resourced, understaffed, and we have these major, sort of hiring goals, it clarifies what the priority is. And, so one is that it's a great opportunity for a leadership team to just get very clear on what, whether diversity is an afterthought or whether it truly is core to what they're doing. And you see that, it's basically like separating oil and water right now. We can see the organizations where it's getting cast aside. We can see where it's becoming the ultimate focus. And I think those organizations are the ones that are going to leap ahead right now. I think it does, force us to change our systems and structures and and ownership, right? In this moment where we're under-resourced, we actually have to, Chris, you said this earlier beautifully, we have to really write a new playbook right now, because clearly the one that we've had to date is not going to be the one that gets us ahead. So I actually think that, amid these sort of, similar to the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, we had to change our playbook for work, right? And it actually led to some pretty great improvements in many cases. Well, all of a sudden, the working mother can work from home. We thought that wasn't possible. It actually is.
100%.
The person with a disability who couldn't commute because of the awful public transit, accommodations, can now actually work remotely as well. The on-site interview that was a real barrier for the job seeker who, couldn't travel can now actually be a virtual phone screen, right? So I think, we, in a similar way, these new constraints have led us to, have forced us to write the new playbook. I think that's either going to be something we write intentionally or something we're just forced into doing. And so a lot of why I love the events that you do in the community that you've built is you're giving people a community to write that playbook together, and to not have to do it on their own.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I think is needed right now. We're in this together. We're navigating what this all looks like collectively. No one, by the way, has figured it out, longitudinally on their own. The folks that we call experts are ones that usually just have a piece of the equation figured out, So that's why the collective work is really kind of exciting right now.
This kind of goes to quite nicely into the next question. I was going to ask you around, this has also helped and kind of forced in some ways employers to shift their policies and practices so they can cast a wider net.
Absolutely. I mean, if we think about, the simple nature of being able to, just from the accessibility of the hiring process, to be able to participate virtually was a huge win, right? to be able to work remotely, even for folks that said, I have childcare at home that I need to be able to cover half of the week. And if I can have flexibility in terms of when I come into the office, even if I'm still in that geographic region, that was a huge win. Now, of course, we know that the pandemic led us to lose, I think well over, 1 million or 2 in terms of working mothers, because of family obligations. But also organizations have shifted policies in many exciting ways to better, empower those job seekers. And I think we're going to see even more of that. We were really adamant to have working parents as it calls out as an underrepresented community in the work and the research, because we know that, especially for working mothers, it's been a very challenging balance, and in a pretty inequitable landscape, So absolutely, I think that's probably what excites me the most. We have a whole system that's helped organizations track their policies, and we've seen pretty tremendous changes happen in the last 12 months alone, just in terms of opening things up, making those necessary shifts just from a governance standpoint.
Mm-hmm. What are some then practical things we could do then to build the awareness of those underrepresented communities in our organizations?
We love this iceberg metaphor, and I know it's pretty cliche for the HR leader, but it's amazing how still profound it is that so many folks do sort of just think of diversity in terms of visible attributes. And to be able to recognize, if we just focus on these 12 underrepresented job seeker communities alone, right? When we think about the neurodivergent community, the population of people with disabilities, we recognize that so many of the communities that we researched, you can't visibly tell if someone's in the community when you look at their LinkedIn profile. And that still is, for most recruiters, as you know, that still is the way that they do
their go-to
recruitment. They look at someone's name and picture. Oh, cool. So you're a diverse candidate. So one of the things we really pushed for, it was to abolish the term diverse hire or diverse candidate from our vocabulary. We actually think that the term, it's so misused and misunderstood and misaligned among most leaders. Let's just remove it from our vocabulary, because a lot of times when someone says that term, what they mean is something very myopic, right? So we've tried to say, look, if there's one thing you could do among leaders, show the iceberg, sort of metaphor, and have a conversation about the fact that there are the vast majority of diverse traits are aspects that are not visible. And let's just try to remove that term from our vocabulary. That is a fundamental shift that teams could make just to get further along. Then I think we have a chance to ask ourselves, across all these communities, what is my awareness and reach to each of these groups? And you start to realize that, wow, it's we recently, did a poll and found that, only less than 5% of people know a formerly incarcerated individual, right? If we think about the implications of that, for leaders to basically have zero people in their life that fit in a pretty significant job seeker community, we can start to realize wow, we're probably not designing systems that work well for that group if we don't even know a single person in that community, mm-hmm. right? So we've tried to really kind of push this back on leaders to say, yes, we can talk about your organization, but what about you? What's your network and reach and awareness individually? Because if you're the one making policy decisions, it's going to transform the lens with which you do it if you actually are connected to the community you're trying to serve.
I want to switch gears a little bit and
sure.
and ask you, how do we ensure that the job offers that we make are truly equitable?
We did a lot of work around just researching the kind of history of pay equity, and I have to say that was the nature of what we do, as a company is really focused on, kind of hiring and sourcing and shifting bias in the process. When we get to kind of the job offer, this is the piece where we say, best of luck with that. Here are things we recommend, but it's work that we don't really personally touch. So this was a really cool kind of learning experience because we went kind of deep into the history of pay and equity, and you realize that it's so systemic, and also that, the way that a job offer itself is crafted has so many implications on the wealth gap that exists in society. That single point of what exists in a job offer has so many downstream implications. So it's this critical moment that we want to get right. So I'm really glad that you asked about this.
Yeah.
So the first thing is that we realized we really recommend having pay ranges surfaced up front to a job seeker, so there's no ambiguity around what range. A lot of the bias that occurs because a job seeker surfaces a very low pay that they currently have. And then the company, without having communicated a range ahead of time, anchors to that low pay and kind of perpetuates pay inequity at that point. And then when you have the job seeker who's not from an underrepresented community who comes in with a high pay and then negotiates, you see this huge gap, right? So communicating the pay range up front, having mechanisms in place to help the job seeker understand what the job offer really is, because sometimes that is extremely vague. And then having really tight policies around how negotiation is handled so that it's not an inequitable experience for different job seekers. Even just those changes alone start to create a much more consistent experience.
Yeah.
Of course, being able to do ongoing pay equity audits. We wrote a case study about Salesforce where they did this huge kind of audit and reset on their pay equity. They spent $7 million right sizing. And a year later, they discovered the same gaps and they realized, wow, it was because we need ongoing daily systems to ensure that every raise, every job offer continues to follow this consistent process,
Yeah.
So it really was a reminder to us that this isn't a one-time effort. It has to be this continuous ongoing analysis.
But you're right, it has to be systematized as well. Otherwise, you just, like you mentioned, a year later, we're back in the same position again.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They're like, the problem reemerged. What do we do? And they realize, wow, we just have to have the ongoing system.
Well, look, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. For everyone listening, all of those links are already in the bio below, description below. So make sure you check it out. Connect with Arthur. Also, we'll add a link into Arthur's LinkedIn profile because he puts out some really great content there as well. So also connect with Arthur on LinkedIn. But apart from that, enjoy the rest of your day. Congratulations on the book, and I look forward to doing this again soon.
Thank you, Chris. This was awesome.
Thanks.